Joining me now in the studio is William Young, who is the East Asia correspondent for Deutsche Welle, and he's been following the coronavirus outbreak very closely. Thank you so much for joining us in today's program.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
I want to talk a little bit about the numbers. One of the things you've been doing is you've been giving kind of an updated list of how many cases there are, how many confirmed cases, how many people who have recovered, how many deaths. For the figures that are coming out of China, there's also been reporting saying that these numbers may be much smaller than reality. What is your take on that based on what you've been reading and the people who you've been following who are actually on the ground in China?
So what I've been reading and also what on Chinese social media is, for example, a lot of the times there would be desperate family members of some patients who are just very pissed or very frustrated about how the local hospitals are treating and handling the whole situation, so that they would go on to either Weibo or even Twitter to share about the difficulties of their family members trying to access the medical supplies and or also even just getting doctors to check up on them. And there have been people sharing information about how once their family member died in the hospital, the moment that the family member died, the hospital basically call him or her and then ask them to basically contact a local cremation center and then ask the cremation center to pick up the dead body right away, because they don't want the supposedly contagious dead body to stay in the hospital for too long. And so when that happens, basically these deaths are most likely not recorded into the official figures that we're seeing that are released every day.
And now, are these people who have maybe not been diagnosed? They've passed away from, what some people are calling a serious pneumonia, but they haven't actually had the chance to have the official diagnosis of it being the new coronavirus. Is that why they're not being counted in?
Yeah, so actually the process of really confirming a patient as officially infected by the virus is a very complicated process in China. First of all, these patients with symptoms that are already happening need to line up for hours in order to just try to get a CT scan. And then a CT scan showing that their lungs are indeed being infected is not even enough to justify or qualify them for being considered as a confirmed case. After that, they also need to do other DNA tests to make sure that the virus, I guess, there are really traces of virus in their body. And so when that is confirmed, then they can be considered as a confirmed case of a coronavirus patient. But that process could take weeks. And for a lot of the people, a lot of the times, they probably have to go back and visit the hospitals day and day. And then with the traffic ban that are currently imposing in Wuhan, many of them living far away from the hospitals have to walk on foot to the hospital. And when your lung is already infected, for example, one of the sources that I've actually talked to, his father is really pretty much like very weak. And when your lung is, when you have to catch your breath and then barely be able to breathe just on your own, and you have to walk to a hospital, that's basically impossible for him to do that. So a lot of these people ended up, after the CT scan, they were given some medicines, basic medications that are and then they were asked to go home and impose a self-quarantine for 14 days.
So, I mean, we're looking at already more than 20,000 confirmed cases. What is your understanding about, the actual number of confirmed cases? Is there kind of a consensus among people who are observing it about how much higher that number could actually be?
So there are experts saying that the number could already be at 100,000 now. But then again, that is only based on how fast the transmission can happen. As we have already seen by the confirmed numbers, it has way surpassed the number during the SARS epidemic. So they were saying that, and also because there were already 5 million Wuhan people that are outside of the city when the lockdown was being imposed.
Oh,
a
wow.
couple weeks ago. So imagine had that many people already been exposed to this virus potentially for weeks before they left for the Chinese New Year holiday.
And we should just give you an idea about the size of Wuhan. Wuhan is about 11 million people if you
Right.
count just the citizens of Wuhan. So
Right.
to have you're saying nearly half of the population may have been on the road
Right.
during the Lunar New Year holiday.
Right. And that's
Okay.
actually an admission made by the local government when they were being questioned about, the whole effectiveness of the lockdown.
Now, you've been following this pretty closely since January. What is your understanding about the Chinese government's response to this? Is this too little, too late?
Yeah, so a lot of the reporting, including the local sources that I've actually talked to, are saying how in the beginning, the relevant information about the actual what kind of virus it is, and then like how can you contract it, and also how it is transmitted, are all very vague. And like the information that they're getting right before the lockdown was basically it is containable and curable in the beginning. But then when the numbers are really surging over the a few days before the lockdown, and then when the Chinese experts in Beijing finally came out and say that it's clearly that they're already seeing signs of limited people-to-people transmission, that's when they realized that then the government has been hiding up some of the key facts for weeks before they came out and admit that they can no longer conceal the very key information and the extent of the infection by that time.
So it was roughly around January 23rd when the lockdown occurred. So basically they locked down the whole city of Wuhan. That's when we started to get kind of more information from the authorities in China.
Right. So, but then the first few cases existed in like the end of last year. So there is
December.
about a 3 to 4 weeks period where people are still not very aware about wearing masks and wearing, washing their hands. And they still go to even the seafood market that was the place where the virus originated from was still operating for 1 week before they officially closed it down. So imagine how many more people were already exposed to that virus before the government started taking the more serious measure to really try to contain it.
Now, you've also been following kind of what online people are saying online in China about the government's response. What are you seeing there? Like, how are people responding to the way it's been handled in China?
So when it was only the local government handling this whole situation, the frustration was up the roof. That basically everyone was complaining and then criticizing, and their frustration was so strong that you could feel like if the central government did not intervene and really take it over, I don't know, some sort of revolution could have happened at any point at that time. But then when the central government took over, they quickly imposed and then also implemented a couple mechanisms to really kind of like comfort the local and ensure the local community that things are going to be okay once the central government take over. And then they rolled out a couple programs, kind of like the makeshift hospitals that we're seeing right now popping up, not only in Wuhan but in several provinces that are copying this model. So when that started to happen, at least people are feeling a little bit more assured about maybe this epidemic is not going to get out of control.
So sort of like the dissent online or people speaking out against the government response, that has kind of settled down a little bit in the past couple of weeks since they've rolled out more draconian measures.
Right. And the other reason of why we're seeing less of the very sensitive and critical takes on the government's handling of this is because
Joining me now in the studio is William Young, who is the East Asia correspondent for Deutsche Welle, and he's been following the coronavirus outbreak very closely. Thank you so much for joining us in today's program.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
I want to talk a little bit about the numbers. One of the things you've been doing is you've been giving kind of an updated list of how many cases there are, how many confirmed cases, how many people who have recovered, how many deaths. For the figures that are coming out of China, there's also been reporting saying that these numbers may be much smaller than reality. What is your take on that based on what you've been reading? and the people who you've been following who are actually on the ground in China?
So what I've been reading and also what on Chinese social media is, for example, a lot of the times there would be desperate family members of some patients who are just very pissed or very frustrated about how the local hospitals are treating and handling the whole situation, so that they would go on to either Weibo or even Twitter to share about the difficulties of their family members trying to access the medical supplies, and or also even just getting doctors to check up on them. And there have been people sharing information about how once their family member died in the hospital, the moment that the family member died, the hospital basically call him or her and then ask them to basically contact a local cremation center, and then ask the cremation center to pick up the dead body right away, because they don't want the supposedly contagious dead body to stay in the hospital for too long. And so when that happens, basically these deaths are most likely not recorded into the official figures that we're seeing that are released every day.
And now, are these people who have maybe not been diagnosed? They've passed away from, what some people are calling a serious pneumonia, but they haven't actually had the chance to have the official diagnosis of it being the new coronavirus. Is that why they're not being counted in?
Yeah, so actually the process of really confirming a patient as officially infected by the virus is a very complicated process in China. First of all, these patients with symptoms that are already happening need to line up for hours in order to just try to get a CT scan. And then a CT scan showing that their lungs are indeed being infected is not even enough to justify or qualify them for being considered as a confirmed case. After that, they also need to do other DNA tests to make sure that the virus, I guess, there are really traces of virus in their body. And so when that is confirmed, then they can be considered as a confirmed case of a coronavirus patient. But that process could take weeks. And for a lot of the people, a lot of the times, they probably have to go back and visit the hospitals day and day. And then with the traffic ban that are currently imposing in Wuhan, many of them living far away from the hospitals have to walk on foot to the hospital. And when your lung is already infected, for example, one of the sources that I've actually talked to, his father is really pretty much like very weak. And when your lung is, when you have to catch your breath and then barely be able to breathe just on your own, and you have to walk to a hospital, that's basically impossible for him to do that. So a lot of these people ended up, after the CT scan, they were given some medicines, basic medications that are and then they were asked to go home and, impose a self-quarantine for 14 days.
So, I mean, we're looking at already more than 20,000 confirmed cases. What is your understanding about, the actual number of confirmed cases? Is there kind of a consensus among people who are observing it about how much higher that number could actually be?
So there are experts saying that the number could already be at 100,000 now. But then again, that is only based on how fast the transmission can happen, as we have already seen by the confirmed numbers. It has way surpassed the number during the SARS epidemic. So they were saying that, and also because there were already 5 million Wuhan people that are outside of the city when the lockdown was being imposed a couple weeks ago. So imagine had that many people already been exposed to this virus potentially for weeks before they left for the Chinese New Year holiday.
And we should just give you an idea about the size of Wuhan. Wuhan is about 11 million people if you count just the citizens of Wuhan. So to have you're saying nearly half of the population may have been on the road during the Lunar New Year holiday.
Right. And that's actually an admission made by the local government when they were being questioned about, the whole effectiveness of the lockdown.
Now, you've been following this pretty closely since January. What is your understanding about the Chinese government's response to this? Is this too little, too late?
Yeah, so a lot of the reporting, including the local sources that I've actually talked to, are saying how in the beginning, the relevant information about the actual what kind of virus it is, and then like how can you contract it, and also how it is transmitted, are all very vague. And like the information that they're getting right before the lockdown was basically it is containable and curable in the beginning. But then when the numbers are really surging over the a few days before the lockdown, and then when the Chinese experts in Beijing finally came out and say that it's clearly that they're already seeing signs of limited people-to-people transmission, that's when they realized that then the government has been hiding up some of the key facts for weeks before they came out and admit that they can no longer conceal the very key information and the extent of the infection by that time.
So it was roughly around January 23rd when the lockdown occurred. So basically they locked down the whole city of Wuhan. That's when we started to get kind of more information from the authorities in China.
Right. So, but then the first few cases existed in like the end of last year. So there is about a 3 to 4 weeks period where people are still being not very aware about wearing masks and wearing, washing their hands. And they still go to even the seafood market that was the place where the virus originated from was still operating for 1 week before they officially closed it down. So imagine how many more people were already exposed to that virus before the government started taking the more serious measure to really try to contain it.
Now, you've also been following kind of what online people are saying online in China about the government's response. What are you seeing there? How are people responding to the way it's been handled in China?
So when it was only the local government handling this whole situation, the frustration was up the roof. That basically everyone was complaining and then criticizing, and their frustration was so strong that you could feel like if the central government did not intervene and really take it over, I don't know, some sort of revolution could have happened at any point at that time. But then when the central government took over, they quickly imposed and then also implemented a couple mechanisms to really kind of comfort the local and ensure the local community that things are going to be okay once the central government take over. And then they rolled out a couple programs, kind of like the makeshift hospitals that we're seeing right now popping up, not only in Wuhan but in several provinces that are copying this model. So when that started to happen, at least people are feeling a little bit more assured about maybe this epidemic is not going to get out of control.
So sort of like the dissent online or people speaking out against the government response, that has kind of settled down a little bit in the past couple of weeks since they've rolled out more draconian measures?
Right. And the other reason of why we're seeing less of the very sensitive and critical takes on the government's handling of this is because actually over 300 citizens have been either put into a temporary detention or be fined for sharing relevant information about the virus online. And that has not only been in Wuhan, but also all across China. And a very prominent Chinese activist, Hu Jia, he was actually took away from his house and put into a temporary detention when he was originally invited to go on air on Radio Free Asia's show last weekend. So that also just shows how insecure the Chinese government is about having the full extent of the epidemic being revealed to the world.
What are you worried about most right now in terms of this virus continuing to spread in China?
I think what I am most worried about is the number of the recovered people, because I've actually been seeing a lot of these more I consider as propagandic information or short messages about, how many people were discharged from this hospital in what province, and then they kept highlighting that number. But at the same time, just isn't that much information about how did these people recover from this virus, and then what are the treatment that they went through, because I think these information will be very important not only to people in China but also around the world, because then the whole world will have a better understanding about it. And also the fact that the U.S. government claimed that their attempt to convince the Chinese government to let their experts to go inside China and help them have been either ignored or not addressed until yesterday, for weeks. Then that also just shows how either China is still insecure about the outside world getting the first-hand insight about the actual information and the details about this virus.
So I want to shift a little bit now to the situation here in Taiwan. How much of a problem is it that Taiwan is not able to participate in some international bodies like the World Health Organization, the WHO, also the ICAO, which governs international flights? How much of a problem is it that Taiwan is not in those organizations?
So, of course, the biggest problem right now would be Taiwan will not be able to really join the very important discussion that happened during the all those meetings, and then maybe Taiwan's problems will be different from other parts of the world because of the unique connection that Taiwan has with China and the amount of interaction that Taiwan has with China. So when Taiwan's case or circumstances are not being able to really be addressed or elaborated fully at the international stage, then the conclusion that they come up with, I would imagine, would not be able to completely adapt to the situation here. So I think that's also one of the reasons why the current administration has been trying really hard to either convince highlight the fact that being excluded from the WHO meeting could pose a serious risk to the global response.
Now, Taiwan also obviously experienced the SARS epidemic. This is something that happened in 2003. At that point in time, Taiwan was also not a part of the World Health Organization. And we should mention also that the reason why Taiwan is not a part of the WHO or the ICAO is because these are United Nations organizations. Taiwan is not a part of the United Nations. China claims Taiwan is part of its territory, even though the two sides are ruled separately. And China also says that it oversees the health needs of the people of Taiwan. Are they doing that?
Yeah, so that's exactly the controversial point, because while they kept saying that that no one cares about Taiwanese compatriots' well-being more than the Chinese government, it took them 2 weeks or more to finally agree to allow the group of Taiwanese people trapped in Wuhan to fly back here 2 days ago. And then there were, like we know, already some members of that group confirmed to have contracted the virus. So imagine that these people were still in Wuhan, and then according to many of them, accessing the local medical resources is extremely difficult. And then comparing to that to the level of the care that they can receive in Taiwan, then you can just see that China is basically contradicting its own claims of what's actually happening to these people who are being trapped in the epicenter.
Now, it's interesting, even though Taiwan really is hoping to, participate in the World Health Organization, there's actually been a lot of criticism for the way that the World Health Organization has handled this epidemic. Do you think that they are swaying to pressure from China in terms of what they're reporting, the types of information they're sharing, or their willingness to, declare a different level of emergency?
Yeah, for sure, because most of the experts that I've interviewed all agreed that the WHO should have announced it as a global health emergency a week before they actually did last week. And the reason why they delay it later, actually, I think yesterday a French media revealed the inner negotiation that happened within the WHO is the fact that China put pressure on the WHO because they don't want the epidemic to be considered as a global threat, because they are worried about how the repercussion is going to happen to the country, like the travel bans that we're actually seeing right now being rolled out by more and more countries, and including Taiwan, who just announced that yesterday that they're going to take a stricter measure on people who have been to China, and specifically to Wuhan and Hubei province.
I'm curious to know, with countries actually speaking out on behalf of Taiwan. So, for example, Japan, also Canada have both spoken out on behalf of Taiwan's participation in the WHO. Do you think that this is actually a point in time where it might actually be more possible for Taiwan to participate, or there might be more support for this, and that could actually pave the way for Taiwan returning to the WHO as a participant or as an observer?
Yeah, for sure. I think the amount of the support and also the concern about Taiwan being left out of the WHO has been championed and also highlighted by so many major countries around the world. And their reasoning are all very consistent because, leaving out Taiwan, who actually could be one of the first few countries that are impacted by this epidemic because of its, again, close relationship with China and interaction with China, could actually pose a very serious threat to the global public health system, and also the fact that leaving out any country and allowing the epidemic to have the possibility of spreading and growing in a place where the WHO is facing so many political challenges is actually going to, again, not be it's basically a counterproductive way of fighting this global disease in their views.
Now, so far, Taiwan has been largely successful in keeping the novel coronavirus outside of its borders. Right now, as of today, there are about 10 or 11 cases so far, less than a dozen cases. Why do you think that Taiwan has been successful in doing that, despite the fact that it's not privy to WHO information or information from China?
I think the SARS experience has really left a deep trauma in Taiwanese people. So when the experts are correlating this virus to the SARS virus, people immediately raise their level of awareness. And also, we need to remember that there are some people who played a very important role during the SARS epidemic now at a very crucial position in the administration, including our vice president, who actually was the person who's behind the whole coordinating and orchestrating the whole combat against SARS effort at the time. So I think that actually helps a lot in terms of Taiwan being prepared for what could happen. And then we immediately set up these very strong and crucial guidelines to ensure that the loopholes would be blocked before the virus even started spreading within Taiwan.
How have people in Taiwan on social media responded to this outbreak? What are their thoughts about what's happening in China?
So, at least under a lot of the articles that we publish at Deutsche Welle's Chinese Facebook page, oftentimes what we see, it's if it's a report about how the Chinese government has not been really revealing the full extent of the epidemic, then a lot of the people would immediately project the stereotype that they have about the Chinese government and say, see, this is all because of what the Chinese government has always been functioning, dictating and being arbitrary, controlling all the flow of the information. That's why the epidemic happens. And there are some extreme examples that I've actually seen online where people are clearly frustrated about the Chinese government blocking Taiwan from joining the WHO meetings. And so they are saying how the whole epidemic spreading across China right now is the karma that the Chinese people had to endure because of its government's evil treatment of Taiwan. And I think those are the extreme examples of how a discussion about China often goes the more extreme direction in Taiwan, especially when it comes to something that's negatively impacting China, and then also that originates from China, but it's probably going to have a potentially very negative impact on the world. And they consider that as it's all China is all, it's all China's fault, and then these people deserve it and things like that. So
Do you think this is indicative of what the average person in Taiwan thinks, or is this something that's just fueled by kind of the internet being what it is, the medium itself?
I would love to think that it's more like being hyped up by the internet and also the so-called echo chamber that we're seeing over here, especially we're just after another election. And then we're actually seeing also the political atmosphere here in Taiwan are sometimes influencing how the society is responding to things related to China. Because we also know that the government right now is standing very firm and highlighting, re-emphasizing many times about how Taiwan is being bullied by China. Maybe that also plays a little role in terms of how people perceive the role of China and what's happening over there.
What would you like to tell the rest of the world about how Taiwan is experiencing this outbreak of the virus? What do you think that people get wrong about Taiwan's response or Taiwan's experience?
I think a lot of the times what I see sometimes on like the international media or around the world is that people automatically still believe that Taiwan is part of China. So this whole response that China is rolling out probably is also being
rolled out in Taiwan,
here, or like the similar challenges that China is facing are also happening here in Taiwan as well. But clearly, I think what's very important to know is that Taiwan has its own healthcare system, and including a very different healthcare insurance system than China, and also the fact that the government has a full control about its border and the immigration policies, and also the response that should be implemented at what stage. So when it comes to reporting about the impact of that on Taiwan, I think the international community just needs to remember that Taiwan, again, is a very de facto sovereign state that has its own capacity to really deal with what the potential impact that the virus is going to have on the island.
And this is really important to remember too when you're considering banning people from certain areas entering your country or banning certain flights. We've seen this particularly with Italy stopping flights to and from Taiwan because Taiwan is not part of the ICAO and is actually listed under China. So when they consider having a flight ban for China, then Taiwan is automatically included in that. Do you think we're going to see more countries that are having a similar response to Italy? And actually, Vietnam also did that temporarily as well, but that's been lifted.
I think the foreign ministry did a very good job at, highlighting how the mistake again is originating from the WHO's designation of the status of Taiwan
and the ICAO.
Yeah, right. And then they made a very public and loud objection towards that, and they spent a lot of efforts trying to explain that to both governments and also to the international community. So I actually don't worry about that being repeated around the world anytime soon, unless the Chinese government again try to intervene politically and then trying to make sure that Taiwan does not use this chance as for being recognized as a separate part from China.
Now, you obviously have been following what's happening on social media very, very closely. I'm curious if you could talk for just a moment about Taiwan's government and how it's using social media to get the word out, how that maybe has changed since SARS, and maybe how that's different than, of course, how the Chinese government is responding on social media.
So definitely comparing to about, let's say almost 20 years ago by now, social media, the government now is very internet minded. So we're, especially this current administration, so we're seeing most of the important head of the government agencies, including our premier, are all on global social media, especially Twitter. And what they've constantly been using a lot of very creative ways to either roll out their policies or explain their policies and to the international community. And that's been receiving a lot of positive responses and receptions because of the fact that they consider Taiwan as trying very hard to be be part of the international community. And I think that the utilization of the social media outlets have really played an important role for that. But as for the social media, the Chinese government's response to the social media, they actually just announced, I think, when Xi Jinping was actually given a talk during a very important higher level Communist Party meeting, he actually mentioned that the Communist Party need to start regulating more of the online articles or information on about the virus. So I think that we could potentially see a very different development on the Chinese social media in the coming weeks, because for the first few weeks when the government did not intervene, there are actually quite a few very useful information and also firsthand news and stories coming out of the epicenters and Wuhan. So
I
now,
think very early on,
Yeah.
there were 8 doctors, perhaps, or people working in the medical industry who had posted on the internet about their experiences and observations, and they actually were brought in for questioning about why they had done that.
Right.
And I think very quickly also hospitals posted notices saying that medical personnel were not allowed to speak with the outside world about what was happening inside the hospital.
Right, exactly. So that again just shows how tightly controlled the information about the entire epidemic is, and also we should always, think about whatever that comes out of the Chinese government's official responses. As in hindsight, we should always remember that these are information that are either already been filtered, and then it certainly tries to frame a certain image about the Chinese government in this whole epidemic, so that we're not going to only just blindly believe that this the entire picture that we're going to be able to see.
William Yang, again, we've been speaking with William Yang, who is the East Asia correspondent for Deutsche Welle and has also been featured in a number of different media, including The Guardian, BuzzFeed News, and whatnot. We'll have all the links to him below in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon. I believe we'll go ahead and get started. It's a pleasure. My name is Warner Green. I'm the director of the Center for HIV Cure Research here at the Gladstone Institutes. It's a pleasure to invite you to this briefing on the 2019 novel coronavirus outbreak. I am joined today by 2 distinguished scientists, Dr. Charles Chu, who is a professor of medicine and laboratory medicine at UCSF and also the director of the UCSF Abbott Viral Diagnostics and Discovery Center. And also my close colleague, Dr. Melanie Ott, who is a senior investigator here at the Gladstone Institutes and professor of medicine at UCSF. Both have wide-ranging expertise in virology, and I hope that we have a very robust discussion this afternoon. So what we will do is to begin just with a bit of background. All speakers have promised that they will not take any longer than 5 minutes. So we should be within 15 minutes into the panel discussion, and at which time we'll be able to answer your questions. I would remind you that we are live streaming. So we want to make sure that if you have a question to ask, that you do so with the microphone so that the live streaming is effective. So why don't we begin? So I will start with what I call coronaviruses 101. So what is a coronavirus? Well, it's actually a family of viruses, RNA viruses, and these are large viruses. That accounts for 10 to 30% of the common colds that we have in adults. Rhinovirus is, of course, the most common cause of the cold, but 10 to 30% of colds are caused by one form or another of a coronavirus. But there can be serious outbreaks of coronavirus infection. Different strains of the virus can cause these outbreaks. For example, as you all are familiar with SARS in 2002, the severe acute respiratory syndrome broke out. We see, in fact, that there was, at this point in time, There were 8,098 individuals who were infected that were reported, that we know of, and 774 deaths. In 2012, there was another coronavirus outbreak called the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. Here there were 2,494 infections to date and 858 deaths. So you can see that with SARS that the death rate was about 9%. With MERS, it's up around over 30%. So where do we stand now with the latest outbreak, the 2019 novel coronavirus? So in fact, the stats, and nothing is certain at this point. We're in the midst of this outbreak. Currently, though, we have, as of this morning, 28,353 infections, 565 people have died, and now the virus has been reported in 28 countries. Certainly the epicenter of this outbreak is in China, and the true epicenter is in Wuhan, and certainly the epicenter of this outbreak. Where do these coronaviruses come from? Well, in fact, we know that the primary animal reservoir for these coronaviruses is bats. But generally, the virus does not transmit directly from a bat to a human. It goes through a secondary host. And for example, in the case of SARS, it was the palm civet. And in the case of MERS, it was dromedary camels were the primary conduit. Now, we don't know what the animal reservoir was for the novel coronavirus. We know that the outbreak appeared in a seafood market in Wuhan, but we still don't know what that intermediary host was or is. Now, it's important to note that these viruses use specific cellular receptors to get into cells, and the cells that they're primarily infecting are cells in your lung, ciliated epithelium, pneumocytes. They also can infect enterocytes in your GI tract that can lead to diarrhea. But the principal manifestation is a severe acute respiratory infection. And SARS uses the angiotensin converting enzyme 2. I think Melanie will say more about this. MERS used a different surface peptidase, the dipeptidyl peptidase 4. And the early studies suggest that the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 is also used by the novel coronavirus of 2019. So in this slide, I try and depict, just give you a sense of what's going on. This is originally this was sourced from the New York Times. So essentially, I've listed here several viruses. Viruses that, for example, bird flu, Ebola, MERS. You see, in fact, on the y-axis is the fatality rate, and on the x-axis is the number of transmissions per infection. So the number of transmissions per infection is what we call R0. And in the case of, for example, measles, if you're infected with the measles, it's likely that you will spread that virus to 15 other individuals. With chickenpox, it's like 8.5 individuals. Now, in the case of the common cold, we're down around 2. Now, these viruses are not very lethal, but as you move up the y-axis, you see Spanish flu, MERS, SARS, Ebola, bird flu. These are the big killers. But you also see that their transmission is lower than that per person than chickenpox and measles. Now, we're not quite sure. So there's a big box here for the 2019 coronavirus. It looks to me like it will probably have an infected individual will likely spread the virus to 2 to 3 additional individuals. Now, it could be bigger than this because there may not be a reporting of all of the infections. It also looks like that the mortality rate is around 2%, But again, we don't know for sure what the denominator is. Well, there may be a lot of undiagnosed infections, and so the death rate or the mortality rate could be smaller. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's why there's this big box. But my sense is that this virus looks like it's a little bit more infectious than SARS and a little less lethal than SARS. So just, but take that with a grain of salt because the data are rapidly evolving. That said, it's an important perspective that there's so much concern about this coronavirus outbreak. But indeed, this is not the biggest threat that we face day to day. The biggest threat that we face from an infectious disease, RNA virus, is influenza. And we're in the midst now of the flu season. There have been, here in the United States, there have been 19 million infections. There have been 180,000 hospitalizations and 10,000 deaths. And we're not through this flu season at all. In general, around 35,000 people die every year of the seasonal flu. So I'm sure you all got your flu vaccines. This year's vaccine is not perfectly matched, but it is matched with 2 of the circulating strains. And if you were infected with one of those strains, it could save your life. So the important point is that not to be overly alarmed by the coronavirus. I mean, I think we should follow with interest, follow what's happening. But this is, there are lots of reactions that are occurring. For example, the Chinese government has quarantined major large cities, an unprecedented level of quarantine. In general, if you look at the history of quarantines, they often occur too late, and they are actually disruptive themselves. I think we now see or are hearing reports that in Wuhan that there are sick individuals who are wandering from hospital to hospital trying to get care. They're running out of supplies. The medical systems is completely stressed. You've seen the remarkable ability, the remarkable building of new hospitals within days. So there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of policy. The United States' own quarantine rules have been put in place. I'm sure we can talk more about that. But my message is that this is an outbreak. It's not an epidemic. We want to keep aware of this particular virus, but it is not the biggest threat that we face day to day in our lives. Certainly not here in the United States with only, I think, 12 infections documented. So with that, it's a pleasure to introduce Charles Chu for his remarks. Again, Charles is a professor of medicine and laboratory medicine at UCSF. Go forward.
Oh, just go forward. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, great. Good afternoon. I'd just like to start by thanking the Gladstone Institute and Dr. Warner Green for inviting me to speak with you today. I'll be going over some of the epidemiology of and a timeline of the outbreak, and I'll also talk just one slide about what we're currently doing here at UCSF. So this is a summary. One thing is I had to be very selective because I noted that there were already over 15 publications regarding this novel coronavirus in journals over the past week alone. I've focused on just a few of the publications. There's one in the Lancet which goes over a timeline of the outbreak. So I just want to briefly review it with you. It was first reported a cluster of cases of pneumonia that were basically seen of unknown origin was reported to the China National Health Commission in December 30th of 2019. By January 1st, the Huanan seafood market, which was thought to be the origin of the virus, was closed. The novel coronavirus was actually isolated roughly just 1 week later. And I should also mention that Chinese scientists have actually made significant progress. They were able to, for instance, make public the genome of the virus in just a few days. after identifying it as a novel coronavirus. They've also generated already diagnostic tests, nucleic acid-based diagnostic tests, as well as antibodies. And also, reportedly, there's an animal model as well that has already been developed by Chinese scientists. The first fatal case was reported in January 11th, and in January 13th was the first case that was reported in Thailand. The identity of the virus, the official name of it, was in January 12th, where it was named officially as 2019 ncov, or 2019 novel coronavirus. And then you have scattered cases elsewhere in Asia as well. And then as of the last week of January, then there were the total number, hundreds of cases that were being reported, mainly from Hubei province, but mostly from Wuhan city. I also show you a slide basically on the right side, where this is published last week in the New England Journal of Medicine about the first 425 confirmed cases in China. And it gives you some idea of the days from infection to symptom onset. So that was a big question. What is the actual incubation period of the virus? And it's thought that, in general, it's very similar to other coronaviruses. It's thought to be mainly from 2 to 14 days or 2 to 11 days, if you want to take the peak of it. Appears to be about at around 4 to 5 days, and that is consistent with other coronaviruses, including SARS and MERS. Similarly, there is also another timeline you see here, which is days from illness onset to hospitalization. And I think this is really important because the days from infection to symptoms may only be on a median of 4 to 5 days, but then you have additional days before a patient actually develops severe enough symptoms to seek medical care and be admitted to the hospital. And that happens to be, on average, it appears to be a median of approximately a week or two, a little more than a week. This is basically a slide that shows you, I got this last night, so it may not be as updated as Dr. Green's, but you see here that we have a total of 28,000, roughly 20,000, it's probably over 30,000 at the time confirmed infections, 12 cases to date in the United States. The most latest was in Wisconsin. This is actually provided by an online resource provided by the Johns Hopkins GISAND. So you can see that. I also want to briefly go over genomic epidemiology. There are a lot of questions about this virus. Has this virus mutated? Is it going to mutate? What's interesting is that so far, as of yesterday, there have been 60 genome sequences that have been deposited and made publicly available. The phylogeny, so what you see here is a phylogenetic tree. It shows the evolutionary relationships among the different coronaviruses from different patients. Notably, all of these genomes are highly related. There are at most 7 mutations relative to a common ancestor. And if you do molecular clock analysis and you track it back to the date of the common ancestor, namely the initial animal to human transmission event, it probably occurred in late November, early December. And since then, there's been no evidence of ongoing animal to human transmission events. All of the outbreak has essentially been sustained by human to human transmission. And then this is the second to last slide. This is a description of the first case of the 2019 novel coronavirus that was reported in the United States. This was the case that was reported from Washington State. A couple of things of note are that you can see here, based on the symptom map, that fever, cough, and fatigue are really the most prominent and persistent symptoms, especially when a patient begins to feel ill. Pneumonia develops typically later. It happens, at least for this patient, it happened 3 to 5 days after the patient was admitted. And if you recall the average time between in the incubation period of, let's say, 5 days, we're talking that severe disease may not develop until 7 to 10 days after a patient initially becomes infected. Interesting also, the one other thing I want to note is that the virus has been detectable in respiratory secretions for up to 12 days after the onset of illness. And even at day 7, there were moderate to high levels that were seen. Notably, for this particular patient, this patient only began decompensating by days 6 to 7. On day 4, the patient simply had mild respiratory symptoms, but during that period, that patient actually had the highest level measured of viral load. And this is of significance with respect to transmissibility. And this is the last slide I have. We are developing a test for rapid detection of 2019 coronavirus infection. The CDC yesterday received EUA approval, emergency use authorization approval from the FDA to test for the virus. They have an RT-PCR assay that uses 3 targets to test for the virus. This is an assay that's being rapidly deployed to both state and local public health departments. We're developing essentially a point of care assay that we feel might be complementary, and it's our hope that we can develop this. We're developing this in collaboration with Mammoth Biosciences, and we're using a CRISPR-Cas-based approach to be able to diagnose the virus within 1 hour of collection of sample. And that's the last slide, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Melanie Ah, who will be talking more about the virus itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charles. Good afternoon. Let me just start by reiterating that what the previous speakers have already said, that this is a very scary and fast-moving infection, but it seems by pure numbers to be much less dangerous than its cousins, the SARS or the MERS virus. And this is shown here in the numbers from the American Society of Microbiology. Numbers, as you see, are outdated by the day because they increase by the hour, but also by this larger study from clinical features of patients hospitalized in China. And so the question is now, is this really a less lethal virus, or are we taking better care of these patients? And it's probably a combination of both. You might notice here on the bottom of the slide that from the 41 hospitalized patients in Wuhan described in the Lancet, 38 were put on antiviral therapy. So what is this antiviral therapy? Just to be clear, there's really currently no specific therapy for the novel coronavirus. All we're doing is borrowing from other viruses. And we're borrowing from the flu virus, we're borrowing from HIV, and we're borrowing from Ebola mainly. So all patients in Wuhan have been treated with Tamiflu. That's probably very familiar to many of you, that if you take early enough in a flu infection, it might have some activity in shortening the symptoms. That is a drug that is relatively specific to an enzyme in the flu virus. But the Thai colleagues in Thailand have reported yesterday that if you use it in combination with the HIV drugs at relatively high doses, they seem to see an effect. The other drugs are the HIV drugs. These are protease inhibitors, extremely effective against HIV. But also in the past having been tested against coronavirus because coronavirus is expressing 2 forms of a protease. So currently, it is probably the most recommended drug in combination with interferon alpha, which is a relatively unspecific antiviral drug that we give often in viruses where we don't have another choice. Currently, it's mainly also hepatitis B infection, but hepatitis C was also treated with interferon for a long time. And so the last drug that is currently rising is a drug that is currently not FDA approved. Both the other ones are available off the shelf and are orally also bioavailable. Remdesivir, which is a drug that has been developed against the polymerase of the Ebola virus, is currently in clinical trials. This was used in the first US patient that actually Charles showed you the data for. And showed some efficacy, but all of these drugs have not been tested in any standardized clinical trial. So we have no idea whether what we're doing is, effective or whether it is, just the natural course of the infection in that specific virus, in that specific patient. Interestingly, Gilead announced yesterday that because of the promising results with its drug, they're starting a phase 3 clinical trial in China now, which will give us a lot of answers that we currently don't have. So these are the repurposed drugs, but there are drugs in the pipeline currently. Let me start that interest in making a vaccine is very high currently, and there's at least 3 companies that have, publicly announced that they are going after the novel coronavirus, either with a DNA, an RNA, or with a nanoparticle vaccine. But the other possibility is to really go very actively using isolated, broadly neutralizing antibodies that have been, very promising against many viral diseases in the past. Most importantly, Ebola in the last few months, where it showed really extremely good effectiveness when it was administered early in the infection. So Regeneron has a broadly neutralizing antibodies against MERS already produced, and this is currently already in clinical trials against with 48 patients against the novel coronavirus. And also Vir here in Mission Bay is currently evaluating safety and efficacy of its previously identified anti-coronavirus monoclonal antibodies, which is not specific against this coronavirus, and it will see if it has any efficacy against the 2019 novel coronavirus. There's also a lot of noise about another polymerase inhibitor that is similar to what Gilead had produced with its drug. It's way further down in the clinical development at this point, but it has very broad effectiveness. It's also a polymerase inhibitor and has very broad effectiveness against 20 RNA viruses, including coronaviruses, and it is considered as a potential promising drug target in the future. So this is what is sort of coming up, what is in the pipeline. The future opportunities, I want to go back to what Warner explained to you at the beginning about the receptor. I think many people in the past have focused on, the SARS ACE2 interaction. So ACE2 is the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 that has been identified as the receptor for the SARS virus. 2 publications came out a few days ago indicating that this is very likely also the receptor for the novel coronavirus. This offers unique opportunities for future therapeutics that are outside the regular small molecule or even antibody realm. I think people have, thought about using parts of the ACE receptor as a decoy to neutralize the virus, or vice versa, use the binding site in the spike protein of the coronavirus to sort of decoy the ACE receptor. There's also ideas to using antibodies against or inhibitors against the ACE2 receptor, which have been developed in the past against the SARS virus. So there is a lot of possibilities here that are currently mainly centered around this receptor, but it will very much depend on whether this is the only receptor or whether it's the true receptor. Also, everything is currently speaking for it being the real receptor. So what are we doing here at Gladstone? I think we're doing quite a bit. I think we are also involved in a similar development of a diagnostic test that Charles has described to you, but with a different CRISPR enzyme. We're also having an active flu research currently ongoing, where we're using primary human organoid models to study the virus, which gives us a lot of opportunity to use this for coronavirus in the future. But in general, we also have a long-standing interest in developing broad-acting, host-directed antivirals in our biofulcrum program here. What we're doing here is really leveraging basic science that's ongoing at UCSF, Gladstone, and at Berkeley in multiple areas of proteomics and CRISPR biology to hone into certain cellular pathways in the cell that are commonly used by multiple viruses. So we're not really so much focused on one individual virus, but more on groups of viruses or viruses even in combination with other pathogens like bacteria, because the hope is that we will develop drugs against these pathways and then be able to better capture or be effective against emerging viruses like now the novel coronaviruses, because we're not so highly specialized on one single virus. So with this, I end and invite my colleagues up to the stage for the discussion part of the program.
Again, let's use the microphone because we are live streaming. Yes.
Is this on? Yeah. So you pointed out clearly this is not the same kind of risk that we run with influenza. But what are the events that happen when a virus goes from being an outbreak and then contained to something that spreads wide enough to where it is with us forever? Because if this were something like the flu, where we're facing it every year, clearly the death rate is higher. It would be a significant difference.
So the cold, the coronaviruses that cause cold kind of wax and wane with the climate, like influenza. There's a flu season and not. But these serious coronaviruses don't have that same type of seasonality. SARS was not controlled by medicines or a vaccine. It was controlled by public health interventions, tracking infections, limiting contact of infected individuals with others, and certainly in the absence of appropriate vaccines and highly active drugs, that's exactly what will be undertaken here. As you can see, I was kind of referring to the quarantine of a city of 11 million and other cities in the province. But you see, in fact, that the spread has now essentially involved every province of China. So, as is often the case with these types of, and this is unprecedented in terms of scope, they're often too late, and they wind up causing a lot of, for individuals who are quarantined, it's very, very difficult. Other questions? Oh, come on.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Thank you for this information. I have two questions in terms of the timelines of publications of all these papers that have come out in such a period of time. What about the peer review process? What's coming out? What you can trust, not trust? And the other question is pertaining in what's happening with children. There's been only a very few cases reported in children, and is it because we don't have the numbers yet, or is there something specific to kids' immunity which makes them more resilient to the virus?
Yeah, so I can answer, perhaps address the first question, which is a timeline for publications. I do know that all of the major journals have essentially expedited the papers or manuscripts that relate to the novel coronavirus. So certainly peer review would be expedited. Many researchers have gone ahead and deposited their preprints into bioarchive as well. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in remaining in reviewing the preprints as well, although those are not officially peer reviewed yet. In addition to that, I think that with regards to the reliability of the published data, I think it's really important to realize that this is a very rapidly changing outbreak, and as a result, even publications in perhaps what's regarded as the most well-respected journals, the authors may, but there was recently, for instance, an erratum that was issued for a New England Journal of Medicine paper that described a German cluster where they described asymptomatic transmission. It turns out that it wasn't really asymptomatic transmission, it was minimally symptomatic, and they had actually gotten the information secondhand, and they had never directly asked the patient whether or not she actually had symptoms. So I think the justification for that is the importance of actually getting this information out to the public as soon as possible. One option would be, if you're interested and you're working in this area, is actually to release your data as a preprint, and many journals will accept preprints and still be able to expedite the peer review process.
Yeah, I agree with this, but I just wanted to say one thing. I think you pointed out very elegantly that the symptoms at the beginning are very unspecific, and the pneumonia and the respiratory symptoms really start very late. So it's really hard to say who is non-symptomatic and who is symptomatic in that case. I also want to say that there is a word of caution. There is also quite a bit of interesting stuff circulating, not so much in the peer-reviewed, but in other medias around, including that the coronavirus diverted from HIV and other things. These are not been in any way have a scientific basis.
So this New England Journal article was very important because it suggested that people might be shedding virus before they had any symptoms. And so you can see that the screening in the airports being used for fever, that, if people were actually shedding virus before they got sick, that wouldn't be useful, really all that useful. So the New England Journal, the first patient that was thought to be passing it in an asymptomatic way, as was said, actually did have symptoms. But there's another patient that acquired it from that one who then passed it to a second patient, and that individual was not did so before there were symptoms and was never exposed, and the other individuals were never exposed to the first one. So it's I'd say we don't know yet. We don't know yet. But if it's like other coronaviruses, it's very likely that it will be passed once you develop symptoms. Also, with the coronaviruses, for example, with MERS and with SARS, that in fact viral load increases. It's delayed, increases at 6 to 8 days after symptoms, and that puts the medical community. There is a tremendous number of nosocomial infections with these coronaviruses because it's the physicians and the nurses that are caring for these people in the hospital when in fact they are shedding virus at the highest rates. There are the classic unbelievable outbreaks of MERS in hospitals that spread to 186 people. It's a wonderful epidemiological study, but the delayed production of virus puts the medical professionals at particular risk with this virus.
I think the children question is very interesting. I don't know. I think we have to wait and see. I don't know if there's anything particularly known with the SARS or MERS virus with children that stands out. But maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there is some data from the SARS and the MERS literature and the reporting that children, for some reason as well, they tend to, even if they're infected with SARS coronavirus or MERS, as well as this novel coronavirus, they tend to have fewer symptoms and are less likely to deteriorate clinically. So the basis for that is really unknown. But this virus, the 2019 novel coronavirus, appears to fit the same pattern as SARS and MERS in that folks who are, or patients who are elderly or who may have pre-existing conditions, heart disease, diabetes, liver disease, et cetera, are more likely to decompensate and develop pneumonia and life-threatening complications as a result of the infection.
Elderly defined as older than 60. Bob.
I'm interpreting what Dr. Ott had to say as there is no evidence to support that sort of tabloid thing we've been hearing that this came out of some lab someplace, a mistake. But as a layman, I'm wondering, for years we've been hearing warnings about overuse of antiviral medications and things like that. Could that be something that contributes to the mutations you've seen as opposed to sort of a natural pattern of mutation?
No, I don't think that, this is a virus, this is a zoonotic infection. It starts in an animal, or in a bat, and likely passes to another animal and then into humans. And then the virus has adapted in that intermediary host to improve its ability to spread human to human. And that's what we're seeing now with this outbreak. So I don't think that we don't have antivirals. Maybe we would see the emergence of antiviral resistance with the passage of time. But no, this is not something that was man-made in any way. We are simply the end host of this chain of infection.
And the virus in general is not regarded as a very fast mutating virus. It is unlike other viruses that we have who can adapt very fast. So I think also the accumulation of mutations in that outbreak, I think, indicates that it's probably not going to be, mutating at a very fast rate.
So this just has to do with sort of the attempt to contain this. It seems like China is doing kind of Herculean efforts to building a hospital of 1,000 and so on in 10 days and so on. But what worries me is that once this gets into India and other countries that are much less able, for instance, to pull off such a containment, that it will be very difficult to contain. What can you just comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first thing I would like to stress is that there's no evidence of sustained transmission in any other country other than China. So essentially all of the cases that have been reported so far in other countries have really been either returning travelers from China and or their close household contacts or healthcare workers. And I completely agree with you. I mean, I think right now we're actually currently at a transition point because the question is whether or not the outbreak can be contained in China. If it cannot be contained in China, if these measures that and if enough resources are not really devoted towards addressing the outbreak in China, it's only a matter of time, I believe, before you will see infections spill over. And it really doesn't take, as you can see, that much undiagnosed infection for it to, say, lay hold in a different country or become established in a different country. I agree with you that many other countries, especially in the developing world, are really poorly equipped to be able to manage this magnitude of an outbreak. We already see some examples, including, for instance, the Ebola virus outbreaks in West Africa, just the difficulty in low-resource settings of being able to implement even basic public health interventions to prevent spread. Notably, in Africa currently, there are actually only 2 laboratories in Africa, one in South Africa and one in Senegal, and these are both large national reference laboratories that can even test for the virus. So that gives you some idea of kind of the magnitude of the problem that would occur if this virus is able to exit China and basically become established in another country. I do think, though, that there have been efforts, for instance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have dedicated $100 million to helping to fight and contain this viral outbreak, of which a substantial portion will be bolstering up low-income, low-resource countries and their public health infrastructure. So if there does happen to be a local outbreak, it has a better chance of being contained.
So part of the etiology that's been described for some of the patients that go through this decompression and also degrading health status was cytokine storm. So that indicates a very robust response from the host. Are there any therapies that are being tried to help those people from the host perspective?
Do you want to comment? You can comment.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I think this is something that is currently been studied, and the indication is that there is, very specific cytokine induction in different cell types, and that these can, lead to a cytokine storm, sepsis type of deterioration of the host, and I think everything that we know about neutralizing these cytokines is going to be applied to interfere with the acute situation in these patients.
Yeah, I would just like to comment that it's actually it's currently very difficult to study these questions because unfortunately, cultures of isolates, really unique cultures of the virus to be able to study this both in cell culture, organoid models, or even in animal models. So to really, but one issue is that we don't even understand, for instance, with respect to the lung pathogenesis, whether the much of the pathology, the pathophysiology is due to direct invasion or damage of the lung, or is it due to an autoimmune response or a cytokine storm? So these fundamental questions really need to be studied, and much of the focus has really been, understandably, on the epidemiology with respect to the research being done and to aid the public health response. But I think ultimately we'll need to do the basic science to really understand that, to be able to really address, develop targeted therapies that would be effective.
Hey, thanks for the information, guys. So I had two questions. One is, what's the major route of transmission for the virus? I noticed that there were positive PCR detection tests in fecal samples, and I wonder if that's a major contributor of viral spread. My second question is, do patients that are infected and recover develop a sterile immunity to it, or is there a possibility of reinfection?
Well, I will talk about spread. In general, it's respiratory droplet spread, but there can be fecal-oral spread as well. But respiratory droplet is the principal. That's hand washing is critical to kind of interrupt that chain.
And the question is whether or not there's a sterile immunity to it. So the answer is we don't know. We do know that there are 4 circulating human coronaviruses, OC43, NL63, HKU1, and 229E. So these are seasonal, essentially seasonal human coronaviruses that, as Dr. Green said, are thought to cause anywhere from 10 to 30% of all respiratory infections. At least with those coronaviruses, it does appear that if you are infected, there is a period of time where that you develop some immunity to it. Now, to that particular strain, I should stress. And we don't know whether there's cross-immunity if you get infected by a different strain of coronavirus. And we also don't know about the durability of that immunity. It certainly is longer than the immunity that you get, for instance, from influenza. But certainly over time, the antibody titers will wane, and presumably you would lose immunity. It's very difficult to extrapolate, though, with respect to this virus, simply because it's so new, and we don't know yet, for instance, whether patients who have recovered, are they now immune, or do they have risk of perhaps contracting the disease again and having a milder illness? We simply don't have answers to those questions yet.
Well, this is a very important question for the vaccine. Because if patients don't really develop sterilizing immunity when they have the infection, then a vaccine is going to be having very poor chances. So I think these questions will all be, addressed when we have better models and also when we have potentially first vaccine candidates.
It's interesting that there was a SARS vaccine developed, but it wasn't tested because the SARS had receded by the time it was available. There was interest in the SARS outbreak in terms of using convalescent serum or plasma, but again, in an uncontrolled kind of anecdotal way.
It seems to me that if a vaccine were going to be tried, that to scale up rapidly, that an RNA or a DNA approach could be, at least theoretically, faster than a protein-based one. I've just lost track. Has that been done on a large scale, DNA or RNA vaccines? And also, have there been, the other question was, are there vaccines against the other circulating coronaviruses?
So the current attempts are including DNA and RNA vaccines and approaches, and I think that has been tested, I think, against MERS also in terms of a development, but not yet in a final product. I think the nanoparticle approach was particularly interesting because it is one that was just also approved for the influenza vaccine, and so they have a very good platform to go into there. But I think in terms of fast response, you're totally right. I think DNA and RNA vaccines are probably faster to adapt to that specific virus.
In addition to development in companies, which is primarily where vaccine development is occurring, the NIH or NIAID's Vaccine Research Center has launched a major effort Tony Fauci is suggesting that they will have a vaccine candidate within about 3 months, but that it would take probably about a year for safety and validation.
And the NIH is very closely working with all these candidates because there's really a concerted effort to, include every available avenue to work together to be fast. And that goes to what Charles says. Right now, we are all a little bit sitting on our hands because we cannot get our hands onto the virus because there's no distribution of any viral isolates or even samples. And so I think there is really a need to accelerate that so that many more people can work on it and we can move faster on the basic biology side. Right now we are sort of working off the genome sequence of the virus basically in large extent.
Any other questions? Okay, well
Does a mask help or hurt?
So CDC does not recommend wearing masks. Clearly, medical personnel in close contact caring for patients with the coronavirus should take all precautions. But in terms of day-to-day interactions, hand washing is far more effective. The surgical mask, it's not protecting you from acquiring a virus from someone else. What it's designed to do is to keep the surgeon's germs, if you will, out of the operating field. But it's not designed. So the N95 masks are better in terms of containing, protecting you, but often those are ill-fitting, and so the virus just goes around the corner.
Yeah, so the one exception is that, so the recommendations by the CDC are for healthcare workers if they're treating suspected or confirmed cases of the 2019 novel coronavirus to wear masks. And typically we would use N95 respirator masks that have been specially fitted for the healthcare worker. In addition to that, the recommendations are to put a mask on the suspected patient or individual who may be infected with the novel coronavirus as well, but not to wear masks in public. And it's also recommended that that members of close household members or contacts of a known or suspected infected case should also wear masks. But aside from that, there are no recommendations to wear a mask in public, at least not the current time in the United States.
So I have a question about the race and ethnicity about the transmission of the coronavirus. Do you think there is a different rate of transmission or mortality in different races or ethnicity? Or have you already seen this in other types of coronavirus?
So essentially all of the coronavirus is just like influenza strains. They start in Asia, and probably because of the very close interplay of humans with livestock, with other animals, et cetera, so there's an admixing of these viruses. So, for example, when the CDC tries to predict what flu vaccine to make, they're sampling in Asia, they're sampling in China, trying to figure out what viruses are circulating there to try and make the best flu vaccine possible. And so it's not, it's not unusual that the three coronavirus, or two of the three coronavirus outbreaks have kind of started in Asia, in China. It's nothing to do with the Chinese as a people. I think it has to do with their close association and interaction with animals, et cetera, propelling this type of zoonotic infection.
Yeah, perhaps also to add on that, there currently is no evidence that ethnicity influences either the severity of the illness or how transmissible an individual is when infected.
what is it there anything known about these coronaviruses actually in bats? Like, what's their physiology and what's going on in the primary reservoir?
So yes, bats are the primary reservoir. There's a slew of these coronaviruses in the bats. The bats aren't sick. They're not dying of coronavirus respiratory distress, but they are, and there seems to be this unique secondary host. Like originally when SARS, it was the civet, the cat. But then it was subsequently figured out that in fact the civet got the virus from the bats. And there's a whole slew of these coronaviruses in bats. So maybe the next coronavirus, maybe we ought to be looking at bats more carefully.
I think it's being done. I think there's systematic sequencing of viruses in the bat, and they have, I think, discovered up to 60, but they're continuing. They know that it's not, the end of it. And there's also interesting first biology been done to show that the bats actually don't recognize these coronaviruses in the same way like we do, and that's why they have less inflammation and less, disease development. So there's beginning really interesting studies coming out there to show that these bats have, because of unique, innate differences with us, an advantage on hosting and developing these viruses.
Yeah, one last thing is that based on the bat coronaviruses that have already been sequenced, actually this virus, this novel coronavirus, actually has 90 to 94% identity to bat coronaviruses that have already been sequenced and were placed and added to the database. This virus, in comparison, only has 80% identity to SARS coronavirus, which is its closest relative among the human coronaviruses.
Well, I would like to thank you for attending this briefing, and for those of you online, thank you for listening. And I think we'll bring this to a close. Again, the final message I think we want is everyone should be watchful. We should follow this outbreak, but we should be secure in the fact that the apocalypse is not upon us. This is a viral outbreak that is that's running its course now. And there's a lot of development in terms of therapeutics and vaccines. We're getting better at dealing with these viral infections. I mean, as Melanie mentioned, tremendous progress with Ebola. So I anticipate that we're going to get better and better at handling these coronavirus infections in the future. But right now, it's not, and here in the United States, as we've talked about, only a dozen individuals infected. I wouldn't be surprised, of course, I would predict that there will be more cases. There'll be more cases as slow and steady spread, but using public health measures until we have medicines and vaccines will control this coronavirus infection. That's my prediction. Thank you, everyone.
I'm Haidu, the Defense Minister, Arjit Sajjan, and then two officials from l'Agence de la Santé Publique, la Dr. Teresa Tam, qui est l'administratrice en chef, et son bras droit, le sous-administrateur en chef, Howard New. Ils vont avoir des déclarations. They will have quick statements, and then we can go to questions. We have also people on the lines waiting for questions, and after the declaration, we'll do the little rules for the question. Merci, Monsieur Champagne.
Merci. Alors, bienvenue tout le monde. Merci d'être là. Au cours des derniers jours, nous avons travaillé sans relâche avec nos fonctionnaires.
Welcome to this special broadcast from the Bloomberg School of Health at the Johns Hopkins University. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Simpson, Editor-in-Chief of the Hopkins Bloomberg Public Health Magazine and Global Health Now. We're here to talk about the outbreak of the 2019 novel coronavirus with some of the Johns Hopkins experts who have been at the forefront of the global, domestic, and university preparedness. The coronavirus outbreak involves an emerging virus that's deadly and rapidly spreading, tens of thousands of cases in dozens of countries, including the US, more than 50 million people in cities in China in lockdown, increasing travel restrictions, and currently no vaccine or treatment for this new virus. There's a lot we know and a lot we don't know. Johns Hopkins clinicians and researchers have been sharing the science and the evidence needed to advance understanding of the virus and to determine the appropriate response. They've been advising the public, the health community, policymakers, businesses, and others what to do now and how to prepare for what might come next. Our goal today is to bring their knowledge directly to you. We'll discuss the most important things to know about the virus, the outbreak, and the response. This will include answering your questions submitted before and during the broadcast. With that, let me introduce our panel. Dr. Tom Inglesby is director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security at the Bloomberg School. Dr. Caitlin Rivers is a senior scholar at the Center for Health Security. And Lauren Sauer is director of the operations for the Johns Hopkins Office of Critical Event Preparedness and Response, or CEPAR. Now to our questions. We'll begin with the virus. Tom, what are coronaviruses and why are they so dangerous?
So this new virus that's causing disease in China and elsewhere in the world is part of a family of viruses called the coronavirus family, which infects both birds and mammals, including humans. And in humans, there are coronaviruses that cause mild disease and coronaviruses that have caused very serious disease in the past, including two diseases called SARS and MERS, which we'll probably talk about later. And what makes it particularly dangerous is that in this case, some small fraction of those who get this coronavirus develop very serious lung disease, which can either get them into an intensive care unit on a ventilator or potentially be lethal.
Mm-hmm. And when a person is infected, at what point do they become infectious so they actually can transmit it to other people?
What we know about most viruses is that when people are most sick is when they are most infectious. We don't know enough about this virus to say that that is absolutely the case, but we believe the preponderance of infections are going to happen when people are sick. There is some information in China that suggests there may be some spreading of the virus before people are very sick, and a few studies that suggest that might be a possibility, but we don't have a lot of information about that yet. So just for general purposes, we believe that most of the spread will occur around people who are symptomatic.
Mm-hmm. And for asymptomatic people, if that actually does exist and they can transmit, is that like a whole level of another level of greater concern?
That would be a very serious concern in terms of trying to get control of this virus. On the other hand, the one thing that might be somewhat better, if that is already occurring extensively, is that it would mean that there probably are many, many more people who've been exposed and are not developing symptoms. So it would suggest to us that maybe this is more of a mild illness than we're seeing now. So we'll have to see what happens.
Great. Caitlin, and a question for you from an alum. So the reports have been of say 2% fatality rate, and the alum wonders, like, why is that so alarming? Isn't the flu worse?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I see that reported a lot, but it's actually the case that we don't know yet what the mortality rate is. It feels right that you should be able to compare deaths to cases to get the mortality rate. But in fact, there have been about 24,000 cases in China right now, and half of them were infected in the last 5 days, or reported rather, in the last 5 days. Those people are still sick, and we don't know what's going to happen yet. So it's not right to be able to just do that division. And so the truth is we don't know yet what the mortality rate is. Now, I see a lot of comparisons also with flu. Flu is a very serious public health concern that we deal with every year, and that's true, but we know a lot about flu, and we manage it every year. We also have vaccines, we have antivirals. We're really good at planning for and responding to influenza. We don't have any of those advantages with this novel coronavirus yet, and that's what makes us worried.
And you touch on an interesting epidemiological challenge in that we've had a huge surge in reports of cases, but there's a difference with that between an actual surge in the true number of cases. So the reporting may be getting better.
That's right, yeah. When people get sick, especially in the context of a new outbreak, it takes a while to sort of move them through the detection pipeline and the diagnostic pipeline. So just because we see a big influx of cases today, it doesn't mean those people got sick today, but probably they got sick recently.
Great. And Lauren, a question for you. So for many of us, as we think about coronavirus, the only other ones we have heard about are MERS and SARS. And certainly with SARS, that outbreak really kind of lodges in our memory, the 2002-2004 outbreak, which had a pretty bad number of deaths and cases. How would you compare the two between this novel coronavirus and the virus that caused the SARS outbreak?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we know that this virus emerged from a virus that is related to SARS. And we learned a lot of lessons in the SARS and MERS outbreaks. So knowing that this virus is related, but having some information not there that we now have with SARS and MERS is really important. It's also important to remember that we see coronaviruses all the time, and they can cause things as common as the common cold. So we do have a wealth of knowledge about coronaviruses. So while we can't compare the case fatality rates, as Caitlin was mentioning, or even the underlying burden of disease, we learned a lot about how to manage cases of SARS, for example. So we know that infection prevention control processes are really important. We know early detection is really important. So all of the lessons that we've learned about SARS, about MERS, and even about the more common coronaviruses, we can apply in this outbreak.
Great. So a little bit of history there, and that helps us. Great. So Caitlin, can you tell us a little bit about some more about the knowns and unknowns with this outbreak?
So we know the virus emerged in China, maybe in December, maybe in late November, and that it's spreading fairly efficiently in the community. We think on average, one sick person infects 2 to 3 other people. We also know that some fraction of people do experience severe disease. It could be as many as 15%, but we're still learning more about that. What we don't know is how much spread we will see in the US. Right now, there is very little recognized community transmission. Actually, the only 2 cases that we know of in the US got them from their spouse in very close contact. But we don't know if we're going to see more community transmission, more like what is seen in China. We also don't have a great idea of severity, as I mentioned. We're not sure how many people will be severely ill or how many will go on to die, and so that what makes us concerned.
Mm-hmm. Great. Tom, one of the a group here at Hopkins, the Center for Systems Science and Engineering, has created kind of almost a real-time tracker of coronavirus cases. And just taking a look at that map, what jumps out to you? What is anything surprising there, or kind of is this what you would expect for this kind of an outbreak?
Well, it's hard to say in terms of this kind of an outbreak, since this is so unusual and different from anything we've experienced before. It's got its own unique characteristics, but the map shows, first of all, kind of the explosive spread in the Wuhan and Hubei province area and kind of the case finding that's going on now. It also shows how it is now in essentially all provinces at some level in China. We know that we don't believe that Chinese public health authorities have been able to test as efficiently in other places in China, so we don't really know the case burden in other parts of China.
And I think the other thing that we see on the map is the number of cases that are in small numbers at this point in many other countries. A number of countries are just beginning to get testing capability. So in some places in the world, they wouldn't have had a chance to know whether there's disease in that country as yet. And it just shows how connected China is to the rest of the world. They have flights out of Wuhan. There are something on the order of 85,000 passengers moving to other cities around the world every month. So China is very connected to the rest of the world, and we see that on the map. Great. Caitlin, kind of a quick question for you. What signals are you looking for in terms of, as this outbreak transitions, what would you look for in terms of being a signal for a potential severe pandemic?
Right now, most of the community transmission that we see is in mainland China. And if we start to see chains of transmission outside of mainland China, that will indicate to us that the outbreak is really growing beyond what we currently see. Now, the good news with that is that the more cases that we see that we didn't recognize, the more that mortality rate is going to go down. So I talked about a way the mortality rate could rise if we see the people who are sick now go on to have outcomes. Hopefully they recover, but we can't be sure. But there's also the side that has mild cases, and the more mild cases we see, then the more the severity rate will go down. To have outcomes, hopefully they recover, but we can't be sure.
And
but there's also the mild.
I wonder if you could walk us through
side that has mild
China's
cases,
initial
and the more mild
response
cases we
when
see,
these
then
first
the more the
cases.
severity rate will go down.
What
To have
happened
outcomes,
there,
hopefully they
and
recover,
what
but we can't be sure.
and
But there's also the
I
mild.
wonder if you could walk us
the
through
side that has mild
China's
cases, and the
initial
more mild
response.
cases
What
we
happened
see,
in
then
these first
the more the
cases?
severity rate will go down. To have
And
outcomes, hopefully they recover, but
the
we can't
Chinese
be sure.
response in some
But
ways
there's also
was
the
much
mild.
faster in the sense that the genome was sequenced and that information was shared with the world. But now we have seen in the last couple of days some accounts that some of the information that we would have liked to have known early on wasn't allowed to be released. So that we'll have to kind of understand that, because the earlier we respond, the better we're going to be. It's also the case that there is some information that's coming out in various scientific journals that is really not being discussed ahead of time, and it comes out on a Monday, and no one in the public health community had any sense that that was happening even the day before. So I would like to see more information being shared before publication. There could be many reasons for that. On the good side, we do know that even at the top of the Chinese government, there is a direction to all the people who are responding to take this as seriously as anything they've ever done before, and also to be sharing information internationally. So there's a clear direction from the top to share information. It's just the challenge of getting that out. Great. So as part of this outbreak, we hear a lot about preparedness. What is preparedness exactly, and how well are most countries prepared? So one working definition of preparedness is the collective work that's being done to prevent disease, detect outbreaks, and respond to them in the outbreak detection realm, outbreak detection and response realm. And there's a whole community of public health responders, emergency managers, clinical experts around the world in every country that have as their job the work of preparedness. And our center worked with another organization called NTI and the Economist Intelligence Unit to put together the first Global Health Security Index, which tried to assess the ability of countries around the world to prevent, to detect, and to respond. We asked them a series of questions and tried to gauge capabilities in countries around the world. And bottom line of what we saw was that there's a wide range of capability in that area of capacity and expertise, and that every country has a lot of work to do. And you can see that there are many vulnerabilities to this kind of outbreak. So Lauren, let's talk about the U.S. healthcare system. How prepared in general is U.S. healthcare? And specifically, what about Johns Hopkins Hospital? What's happening there?
Yeah, I think there's a wide variety of levels of preparedness across the U.S. healthcare system. And I think it's important to note that the U.S. healthcare system is operating at capacity almost every day, if you think about it across the country. We have a lot of people in and moving through the hospital system every day. And here at Hopkins, we are operating very close to capacity all the time. So the idea that we would have an outbreak like this and need to expand the hospital capacity, whether here at Hopkins or nationally, is concerning. We have people in beds throughout the healthcare system, throughout the hospital, that couldn't necessarily be moved or leave the hospital system if we have a massive influx of patients. That being said, here at Hopkins and nationally, we are firm believers in preparedness, and I think it's important to note that preparedness is significantly less expensive than response, and so it goes a long way. But it's also really hard to prove when it works. So making sure that people are invested in the preparedness activities that we do daily, and not just immediately after, when that sort of muscle memory of the response has not passed, is really important. Here at Hopkins, we use CEPAR, the Office of Critical Event Preparedness and Response, to ensure that our preparedness activities are streamlined across the institution. So we're not giving different messages to our health system or our university, whether here or abroad, and making sure that everyone has consistent messaging on how they can be prepared and what they should do. And I think the idea of employing the CDC guidelines and the WHO guidelines is a perfect example of that. Making sure that we're absolutely up to date on what the nation is doing and what the nation's experts at the CDC are recommending, and putting them in place here, whether it's at our student health clinic, at our emergency departments or our ambulatory care centers, or even just messaging to staff, students, and faculty.
And in the eyes of the public, there's a fine line between preparedness and stepping up actions at a hospital and overreaction. And oftentimes the public expects a lot immediately, but that may not be appropriate. How do you sort of divine that line there? And then and what is Hopkins saying to its community, as well as what other institutions should be saying to their people?
Yeah, I think in this situation, and it can extend more broadly, the most important message is to go with what the facts say and use the information that's available to you to make informed decisions. So following the guidelines that are put out, whether it's at the institutional level or at the CDC or at the WHO, acting rationally and calmly, and remembering those things we've learned from previous outbreaks and previous responses. We know what we're good at, and we learn from previous responses what we're not good at, and we try to make improvements in between. I think the mask example that is all across the media is a perfect example of this. So we have had a run across the country, and I think globally, on the use of face masks and purchasing face masks. And we know, and the WHO and the CDC tell us, that the evidence doesn't support healthy people using masks out in public to protect themselves. And what's important is for us to message to our faculty, staff, students, and community that the masks that they see out in the community are for sick people to protect themselves from spreading to vulnerable populations who they might encounter. So taking that information and applying it more generally is a microcosm of a broader preparedness message. We know the evidence doesn't support it, so how can we implement it at our facilities?
And one more question for you, Lauren. One of the most important parts, I think, of preparedness is building up the diagnostic capability. Can you let us know where the U.S. is right now in terms of diagnostics and where it needs to be in the coming weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and it's so important for sort of protecting our health system and its capacity. Right now, anyone who is identified using the CDC criteria as a person under investigation for the novel coronavirus has to have their test completed, their confirmatory test completed at the CDC. And that's a labor-intensive process. So it means identifying that person either at a health system or through a call-in line, taking their sample, packaging it, sending it possibly to the state health department first, and then shipping it onto the CDC. And we've heard reports that this takes from 24 hours to 5 days, maybe even more depending on where that person is located in the country and in the health system. And then that person has to sit in isolation until their test is complete. I believe it was yesterday we got FDA approval for emergency use authorization of a new real-time RT-PCR test for this, but that'll take some time to implement at the health system or at the health department level. And so getting that on board, making sure we understand what the results mean and how to interpret them, and training people on how to use it, how to validate it, is a really important next step.
Mm-hmm. How soon do you think those diagnostics will be expanded and accessible by other centers?
Yeah, I think it's sooner rather than later, and I think every time we have an outbreak like this, the technology speeds up, and we're seeing that here with the diagnostic side as well. Hopefully within the week we'll start to see these tests, maybe not the real-time RT-PCR, but we'll see the tests that the CDC is using at the state health departments, and then that real-time test will come online shortly to follow.
Great. So Caitlin, we received many questions from our alumni about travel, and they're asking about near-term domestic travel to countries that may have a handful of cases. Are there, I know each case is kind of specific, but are there general recommendations that you would provide for folks?
Yeah, the two places to look are with the State Department and the Centers for Disease Control. Both of those institutions issue travel recommendations, and they're very good at keeping up with the latest guidance and weighing kind of the risks and the benefits to travelers. So anyone considering a trip should check those two resources.
Great. So Caitlin, another question that we received from several people is all around vaccines. Obviously, vaccines are a very powerful public health tool, and apparently there are at least a dozen research projects underway. Are these projects are they connected at all, or is this kind of more the Wild West where everybody is doing their own thing? And how soon do we think actually a vaccine would be able to be tested, developed, and then also manufactured and distributed? What's that timeline look like?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest right now in identifying vaccine candidates and trying to move them through the pipeline. The U.S. government and important nonprofit organizations that help to coordinate these efforts are putting a lot of energy into figuring out what our best vaccine candidates are and how we can expedite that. And so I expect to see a lot of exciting news coming out in the coming months. But that being said, it's unlikely that a vaccine will be ready for use in the general public in months, many months potentially. It just takes a really long time to get the science, to do the clinical trials, to manufacture products, distribute them. It's a long process. And so I think we do need to be thinking about what we will do without having a vaccine on hand.
And what does some of those options look like for a country in terms of a country level response?
Yeah, I think preparing the hospital system to accommodate an influx of patients is really important. Some countries have implemented travel restrictions or recommendations around quarantine, and that's something that each jurisdiction weighs in their own context. But these are the sort of general actions that can be considered.
Mm-hmm. Great. So this is a question for the whole panel here. What are some concrete steps that people should be taking to protect themselves, people as individuals, but then also sort of at that country level as well? So, Caitlin, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. This is a great question because it's also flu season, and so the answers are broadly relevant. Hand hygiene is always a good idea. Cough etiquette, which is coughing into your elbow and not into your hands, is always a good idea. And as Lauren mentioned, if you are experiencing symptoms, regardless of what the cause is, if you want to wear a mask when you visit the doctor's office, that can help protect people in your area from being exposed.
I think the only thing to add is just, and Lauren's already mentioned it before, is that in most places in the country, there's a good state health department or a city health department that is working hard to stay very current. So checking in with the health department about guidance for your location. CDC is changing its guidance on a regular basis as they get new information. So it's a good source of information for the public, both about travel, but also about infection control and the general things that we do to prevent ourselves from getting flu in a season.
Great. Lauren, anything to add?
No, but coming from the emergency department, I'll just reiterate what Caitlin said. Washing your hands is absolutely critical, and definitely get your flu shot.
Flu shot, okay, great. We're going to shift now to some live audience questions, and I'll just go ahead and ask the question, and then feel free to jump in. So some people coming from China are putting themselves under a voluntary self-quarantine for 14 days. Is this necessary?
I don't think we have evidence that the quarantine in this way is proven to work. I think the government has issued new policy around it just over this weekend about putting people in quarantine. We should say that quarantine, in the way we're talking about now, is taking an individual or a group of people who are well, who might have been exposed, and keeping them out of circulation for a period of time. That's different from isolation, and the term isolation is used
to mean taking people who have symptoms and have been diagnosed or are under investigation and having them be in isolation for a period of time. The latter, isolation, is a proven public health intervention which we use all the time for people who have contagious disease. These larger scale quarantines are of less proven value. It is now part of the guidance of people who are returning that if they've been in China in the last 2 weeks, they are now supposed to be in home isolation. And that's the guidance that's supposed to be followed if that person came in, I think, Sunday night or later.
Yes, Sunday 5 p.m.
That's the CDC guidance. Okay. And obviously with quarantine, there are massive ethical dimensions to that. What are some considerations that public health officials should have in mind when they're making this kind of determination and evaluating the need for a quarantine?
I think one piece is it the least restrictive thing you can do while still protecting public health and individual health. And so that's really important for public health practitioners to evaluate. Are there less restrictive options that would still be effective? Is it sound? Is it evidence informed? Are we making this decision out of fear versus out of science and policy? And I think those questions are questions that we can't just ask once. We have to ask them repeatedly as we get more information.
Great. So another question from our audience. So we've talked about the use of masks, which cover the nose and mouth. Can someone be infected through the eyes or from a droplet on food?
I don't think we have a great understanding yet of how this virus, all of the possible ways that the virus can infect someone. We know it's a respiratory virus, and in general, respiratory viruses are transmitted through droplets, through the nose and mouth. Also, touching things and then touching your face is usually not a good idea. And there may be other routes of transmission as well, but I think it's important for the public to really focus on the primary modes, which is droplets and hand hygiene.
When you say hand hygiene, you mean washing your hands?
Washing your hands.
Frequently.
Always a good idea.
Right. And what about the sort of the different like antibiotic ointments or solutions that you can put on your hands? Are those effective, or should we actually be using soap and water?
Soap and water is the best option if you have it available, but alcohol-based hand sanitizers can also do the trick.
Great. So another question from our audience. How do you think the number of actual cases compares to the number of reported cases?
I wish we knew. If we knew that, we would have more questions answered. I don't think we have a good sense right now of how many cases we're not seeing. It's the sense that there are probably a lot, which sounds alarming, but is also a good thing because right now we're seeing about 15% of cases reported in China are severe. If we assume there's a large burden of cases that we're not seeing, that means they're probably mild. And so that means the disease on average is probably less severe than what the numbers reflect. But right now we just don't have a good sense of how many more are out there.
Okay. And the only thing to add to that is just that there are a number of very, very well-respected modelers in universities in different parts of the world who do believe that there are many more cases that we're seeing. I mean, some estimates are 5 times as many cases as have been now reported or more are already present in China, but those are all models. So they depend on the data, and we don't know if they're correct. It also speaks to the particular challenge of fighting a respiratory outbreak like this during flu season, right? I mean, that's got to be a complicating factor.
Yeah, and that's why the epidemiologic piece of the investigation tool that the CDC has set forth is so important. So the travel history is an important element because otherwise you would be testing everyone who came through with with flu symptoms or other respiratory symptoms or a fever. So that's why we've really focused on honing that travel piece a little bit better.
Great. And one more question. When is the peak of an outbreak like this? When do you know you've reached the peak?
You don't really know until after it's happened. There could be a seasonal component, and if so, that may change the dynamics a little bit. We don't know for sure. But right now, it's clear, at least in China, that we're in the expansion period, and so the peak does not seem to be behind us.
And when you talk about seasons, there's a possibility where this outbreak could peak, cases could be dropping off, but then 6 months later, a second wave, as in with the 1918 flu, would you say?
We know that for some coronaviruses, there is a seasonal component. The coronaviruses that we live with every day have a seasonal component, but 2 other coronaviruses that are very important to us, SARS and MERS, because they're quite severe, don't seem to really have that pattern, so we don't know for sure.
Interesting. Okay, great. One last question. How can we prevent pandemics in the future? That's a difficult question. I think it's nature is constantly creating new strains of virus in animals, and they're constantly moving between animals and people. So in terms of a strategy for preventing all of that and preventing the next virus to jump from animals to people, I think that's probably unrealistic. But what would be more realistic is improving the capability of the world to respond to them quickly with early diagnosis, early understanding of the virus, but then a much stronger ability to make vaccines and medicines very quickly. And we've come a long way in the last 20 years along those lines, but if we're still at the point where it takes a year or two to make a vaccine for a new disease, that's really not acceptable in this world and isn't fast enough. And so overall, I think we need to move towards a much stronger capability of responding early with the tools that we can create. Great, thank you. So we're unfortunately out of time. I would like to thank our panelists and all of you for being part of this broadcast. A recording will be made available soon, and we'll be getting that out as quickly as we can. And we're happy to share some links to resources to help you stay informed. So to stay up to date on the university's guidance, you can visit the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Information page on the Hub. And to get the very latest analysis from the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, visit the center's website and sign up for their situation reports. They come out daily, they're comprehensive, and I want you to know we read them all the time. Great to stay up and informed. And you can also subscribe to Global Health Now, the daily global health newsletter produced by the Bloomberg School. We're covering the coronavirus every day in our smartly curated newsletter of the most important news in global health. And I want to make sure everybody knows we have launched a coronavirus expert reality check that answers key outbreak questions. Thank you again for joining us.